Now, 160 years ago, a war broke out, a terrible war between the northern states and the southern states. And part of the reason for that war was that in the southern states, they kept African Americans as slaves, and the ones who weren't slaves, they didn't treat very well. But as the war continued, that got to be one of the key issues rather than just part of the story. Now, partway through the war, there were regiments formed of African American soldiers, and this seemed like a new idea, even though there had been African American soldiers in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. People forget about history, so it was new again. And so they had to have white officers with the African American soldiers. Now, the state of Massachusetts was one of the first places to come up with this idea, and they formed a regiment, and people came from all over the western states and the northeastern states to join. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry filled up, and men kept arriving. Well, the governor of Massachusetts hadn't expected that. One of the first men to arrive after the 54th had been filled was a man who signed in as Andrew Jackson Smith. Now, Andrew Jackson Smith had been a slave, but in Kentucky. Kentucky had stayed in the Union, but some of the slave owners there had gone south to fight in the Confederate armies. And that was what happened with the farmer who owned the farm where Andrew Jackson Smith was owned. Well, at first, he stayed there and worked on the farm, but then the owner of the farm came back and said, being a soldier in the field's hard work. So I want to take you back with me to act as my servant in the army. Now, it's one thing to just work on a family farm as a slave. It's another to fight against freeing yourself and other slaves by working as a servant for the Confederate Army. And so it was that Andrew Jackson Smith and at least one other man escaped that night and crossed over the river into Ohio. Now, the ironic part is that he got a job working for an officer in the Union Army. And so it was that he ended up on a battlefield as a servant to an officer, but one fighting at least partly to free the slaves. And so it was that Andrew Jackson Smith, as he was called then, got wounded at the Battle of Shiloh before he could even join the army, because he was still a servant. There were no African American soldiers allowed in the Union Army at that time. Well, he found out about the 54th Massachusetts, and he went from then Indiana all the way to Massachusetts to sign up, and found himself a day too late. But he was told, wait here, just in case we add another regiment. And so they did. He was one of the men to join the new 55th Massachusetts Infantry, another regiment of African American soldiers. The governor of Massachusetts, though, hadn't been ready for this, and so he had to ask for officers, recruiting officers to meet his standards. Officers for these new regiments of African American soldiers had to be white, experienced soldiers, and basically abolitionists or in favor of the freedom of African Americans who'd been enslaved and willing to serve as their leaders. Not everybody was willing to meet those standards or able to. And some of the ones who were, as things went on, got sick or got wounded or had to leave the army for various reasons. So it was that after a short period of time, they needed replacement officers. Now, Thomas Ellsworth was a white soldier from Massachusetts. He came from a good family. He'd been serving in the 2nd Massachusetts, and one of the officers of that regiment had gone on to become the colonel of the 54th. So he knew about this great experiment. And he was told, you can stay in the 2nd and maybe get promoted up to sergeant, or you can go to the 55th Massachusetts and get up to at least a lieutenancy. And he thought, And he thought and he said, I think I'd like to go to the 55th. It seems like something I should do. And so Thomas Ellsworth became a lieutenant in the 55th Massachusetts Infantry. Now, most regiments in the Civil War were trained to basically stand up and fight on battlefields. But the 55th received different training. When they went into the field, their job was not getting into big pitched battles. They were trained to go out and do raiding. They would do small attacks on different places. Sometimes they would go out and attempt to free enslaved people from plantations and farms. Sometimes they would go and try to tear up Confederate railroads. They and some of the other regiments would go and do these things. And so it was in late 1864. They were assigned as part of a force to do that. What they were supposed to do was tear up a railroad so that Confederate forces would have a harder time sending troops to fight General Sherman. General Sherman and his men were on their famous March to the Sea. Well, the 55th and the other units with them were kind of a motley crew because the general in charge of this particular attack didn't really know what he was doing. He grabbed every unit that he could find, whether they were appropriate or not, and he got them on ships, and he didn't really plan anything. He didn't make maps or have maps made. He didn't get guides to guide the ships into the places that they needed to get across the water. And once they did get there, the orders he gave were messy. He told the commanders of the individual units, if you meet any Confederates, chase them away and follow them because they'll be retreating back to where you want to go anyway. Well, okay, but which way do we go? Oh, there's only one road. Don't worry about it. So they landed, and sure enough, there were two roads. And on the eastern road, there was a small force of Confederates. And the Union officers thought, well, we're supposed to chase the Confederates that way. That's where we're supposed to go. That must be the right road. And so they attacked the small Confederate force, and that small Confederate force really was very small, and that ran away. And so the Union forces moved up the road several miles before the general in charge of things said, wait, that's the wrong direction. You're supposed to take the other road. So they had to come all the way back to where the two roads joined and go up the other road. Well, meanwhile, the Confederate forces in the area were scared because they thought that these Union Army folks were coming up the road to do them harm, and maybe they were going to attack the railroad. Oh no! Well, there was only one place to stand and fight them, at Honey Hill. So the officers of the Confederate forces sent out word, anybody who has troops available, please come and fight. Small units came from all over, from miles around, and gathered at Honey Hill. Now, Honey Hill was not a great big mountain. It was more like just a ridge with a bunch of forest in front of it. But the road came right up to Honey Hill. When the Union forces got near Honey Hill, that general gave all sorts of vague orders again. He told the regiment from New York, now you sweep to the left, and you go around the Confederate position that way. Well, how? How far are we supposed to go? Oh, just do it. Now, there were some sailors who'd brought some small cannon from one of the ships, and they were dragging those, and they were told, you go with this other regiment over here, and you go around to the right, and you get out there, and when you meet the Confederates out there, you chase them away, and then you turn your cannon inward and flank them on that hill. Okay, but how far out are we supposed to go? Just go out till you meet the Confederates. That'll be far enough. Well, they went out there dragging those small cannon, and the New York troops went off to the left, and he told the 55th, Now you go right up the middle and charge right up that hill. They'll be distracted by the things going on the left flank and the right flank. Well, that meant going through the little forest and a fairly narrow road right up to the hill. Now, as it turns out, those New York troops that went to the left, the first thing they ran into in the direction they were told to go was a swamp. And they didn't know how deep the swamp was, and they didn't know how big the swamp was, and they didn't want to just cross into it without knowing those things. So from the far side of the swamp, they fired a rifle shot or two up the hill to see if the Confederates would notice. The Confederates pretty much ignored them. Those troops with the cannon going around to the right, well, they dragged those cannon off and off and off, and they didn't see any Confederates in front of them, so they weren't sure what to do. And their orders had never said, well, in that case, turn back and flank the troops on that Honey Hill. They just kept looking for the Confederates because they knew that's where they were supposed to stop and fight and then turn. So it was that when the 55th approached Honey Hill, there were no distractions on either flank. All the Confederates had gathered there on top of the hill. They were ignoring the stuff on the flank because they knew they had to hold that road. And so it was that a few cannon and a whole bunch of men with rifles opened up on the 55th as the 55th charged up the hill. As it happened, one of the first things that occurred was the commander of the 55th, he and his horse were both wounded. The horse fell and pinned the colonel down to the ground. The color bearer of the 55th was also wounded, and the colors, the flag. Now I should explain this. In the Civil War, the flag that each regiment had was special. It was something that was generally given to them by the place they'd come from or by the people who loved them. And these flags were special. There was a regimental flag and there was a United States flag. And those flags were about to fall to the ground because the man who was carrying them was wounded, shot. Well, Thomas Ellsworth, he went to where the colonel had fallen, and he called to two of the men, "Help me get this horse off of him." And he called out to Andrew Jackson Smith, "Smith, grab the colors." Well, Andrew Jackson Smith ran up and got those flags, even though there were bullets flying all around him. And he got the men to rally back to him, while Lieutenant Ellsworth got the colonel back under the safety of the trees in the woods. And as many of the men of the 55th retreated right away, and some of them had to wait until dark because they were pinned down by the gunfire. Well, that battle was the most horrific thing that the 55th endured during the entire war. In fact, the majority of the casualties they had during the entire Civil War were in that brief one-day fight. And most of it during about 15 to 20 minutes of that fight when they were first charging up the hill. Later, much later, both Thomas Ellsworth and Andrew Jackson Smith were put up for the Medal of Honor, the highest award that the nation was giving to soldiers. It took a while, though. You see, when the colonel was wounded and unconscious for most of the battle, his battle reports hadn't been exactly the best in the world. And later, the Army said, "Well, was there anybody that you recommend for the Medal of Honor that we didn't get around to giving it to?" And he said, "Yes. There was Lieutenant Ellsworth and then that fellow who saved the flags." Well, this was years after the war by then, and people that's still alive knew that it was Andrew Jackson Smith who had saved the flags. And so they sent to the War Department, "This is the man that the colonel was talking about, Andrew Jackson Smith." And the War Department said, "That's nice, we'll get around to that." 30 years after the war, they gave the Medal of Honor to Thomas Ellsworth. By then, he'd been a federal employee for many years, working for Customs Department in Massachusetts. In fact, he retired and came out to California a while after that, coming out here where his son lived in Pasadena. His son was in the construction business. Andrew Jackson Smith had survived the war also, and he'd gone back to Kentucky, becoming a fairly successful landowner there. In fact, some say he ended up owning some of the property that had belonged to the man who'd enslaved him. But his award didn't come. The people who had been there at Honey Hill began to die off. And still the Medal of Honor for Andrew Jackson Smith didn't arrive. The War Department said, well, the paperwork's slow because of the way the colonel filed it. We'll get around to it. And they did. So it was that World War I happened, and World War II happened, and the Vietnam War happened. And in 2001, the Medal of Honor for Andrew Jackson Smith was awarded by President Clinton just before he left office. It was received by his daughter, who was still alive then. Thomas Ellsworth, as I said, came to Pasadena. Andrew Jackson Smith settled in Kentucky. The two men may never have met after that. They certainly didn't meet after Andrew Jackson Smith's medal arrived because they were both long dead by then. But the story of two men awarded the Medal of Honor as a part of Black history, a white officer and a black soldier, is something that should never be forgotten, especially when both of them became successful in their own ways after the war, and both of them received their honors so late, so late. But that is the story of the 55th Massachusetts, the Battle of Honey Hill, and two soldiers.